Wow, it is hot in here, without a doubt. So if anybody walks out, I won't take any offense. Good job, Eric, by the way, and congratulations. I have no big announcements at the end of my event, so I'll just leave it at that. Can't really compete with that one. I'm really glad to be here. I think it's a wonderful setting. I'm Sean Petersen from IFC's Venture Capital Group, from the for-profit arm of the World Bank. Some people know one of those names, and today I'm going to talk to you about the key elements of venture ecosystems. And I worked out the clicker, great. So what exactly is a venture ecosystem? It's up there on the wall for you guys, but I mean, it's really about how it's certain elements all coming together. There really isn't one single element that needs to be there, but it's all of them working together. And that's what we normally look for when we go and try to do work in these ecosystems. We try to identify what is and isn't there. And so simple things like building supply of highly talented people is a very important step and not always there, or more often than not, there's not usually mentors, because often you have people who haven't had success before. So some of the people in this room may have come across the examples of Israel, Singapore, or maybe even New York. These are ecosystems that have truly developed and proven that they can build the venture ecosystems, and each one of them is pretty well known for different reasons. The Israeli government is probably best known for the policies that it's created consistently now for, it's over 3 decades. And it's known probably best for something called the Yozma program that was set up several years ago. And what they did is they invested just under $100 million into 10 different venture funds. And they provided about 40% of the capital. So they were expecting other people to come in and crowd in the other, say, however big the fund was. But what they said was, we're also going to allow you to bring your money in, and we're going to protect 80% of your downside. So it created this kind of win-win for private investors to explore going into a new market like Israel and to promote it. And on top of it, for the really risky opportunities in Israel, they set up a separate tech incubator program where they brought in large technology companies to run these incubators, like a Microsoft. And they asked them to put a little bit of money into the companies that would be incubated, but more importantly, they had to commit to bring mentorship to the incubators, and they had to be able to bring international trade and partners to those incubated companies. And so those two things together really laid the foundation for what is today the 5th largest venture market in the world. And so if you're ever going to study venture ecosystem, you'll probably read the case study on Israel, and they have done it quite well. We also have Singapore, which is better known for ease of doing business. Lots of people have probably been there, and it's known for you can fire somebody in a day and you can hire someone in a day. You can basically count on the fact that there's really no crime. They have strong IP protection plans there, so if you do set up your company there, you're protected. But one of the things people don't know as well is something called the Entree Pass, which Manan would love, because it was all about how do you get best talent into Singapore. And if you run it like certain countries, maybe America included in this one, and you make it hard for immigrants that have great ideas to come to your country, it doesn't happen. So one of the key pillars of their program was to make it easy for entrepreneurs to move to Singapore and get residency and ultimately actually get a Singaporean passport. The other thing they did is they did try to mimic some of what Israel did. In the early 2000s, they funded a bunch of different ideas, and it didn't work out exactly as planned. So if there's any Singaporeans in the room, I don't take offense. But what they did is they learned from the mistakes, and in 2009, they rebooted with kind of a program where for every dollar a foreign investor or another investor whose private money invested, they would match somewhere in a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio, and made it extremely compelling for capital to come in there. And if you go there now, there are a series of venture funds that are based there. There's a significant deal flow. My team is, one of our groups is actually based in Singapore, and we've kind of watched from 2012 to now. It's just amazing the depth of that market and how fast it grew. And then I'll talk about my hometown, not because I'm a New Yorker who has to talk about New York, but I think it's a very good example of you can always create a tech incubator. People often, or a tech innovation center. people often think of New York as Wall Street, and obviously it must have had all the elements. Well, I'm a Silicon Alley 1999 graduate. My first company I fundraised in New York, and there was like 2 funds, and we were kind of this weird group of people who were trying to do venture in New York. And after the financial crisis, the city of New York got heavily involved and wanted to have this ecosystem get established. And they did some very specific things with talent. They did some very specific things around creating spaces, literally spaces for people to work, because by the way, real estate's pretty expensive. And then they launched an open city program where they said, here are the problems the city's facing. Here's all our data. Why don't you solve it? And it actually created a rush of entrepreneurs who wanted to solve those problems and technology companies who wanted access to the data. And that really was the beginning of what is now New York is number 2. I don't know if you'll agree from the West Coast one, but it's basically number 2 in the US, and that probably wouldn't be the case if they hadn't worked that hard post the crisis. So what we did learn from all those examples, and you'll see for any country that does it, or city or state, is that it's really important that the city and state are actors in these programs. It's not usually just a creation of itself. So I have an eye chart for you all. You won't be able to necessarily read it, but this is something the Endeavor Network does. The Endeavor is a big global entrepreneur support network. And what they try to do is really marry mentors into programs to foster young entrepreneurs and crowd them with the best advice possible. And this is a map of how the ecosystem of 1996 looked in Argentina's tech market. And there was just basically a few companies, and they weren't really interconnected. And then over time, over the next 15, 20 years, a lot of people left one company and went to another company or started another company or funded another company. And this is ultimately what it became. And it doesn't really matter what the dots mean, but they actually mean companies and founders. But what you can see is everyone became hyper connected. And you get to this point where the VC ecosystem can be so powerful that you have a technology sector now that is a significant part of the GDP of Argentina. And this is what gets the IFC and the World Bank excited. This is the kind of thing we'd like to replicate in other markets. I don't like to presume that you can, so we don't presume every market can do this, but this is an example of success. So now the question is simply, why do you do this? And I think someone else earlier today, I was in a session, talked about cell phones and internet, it's all spreading. But I like to point out smartphones is where a lot of the market's heading, and I know Eric spoke a little bit about the penetration, is smartphones, literally all the new ones, 80% of them are all gonna be in the emerging markets. And so that's gonna be data consumption, and that's gonna be applications, and that's gonna be solutions. We wanna help make sure that there's venture ecosystems that are propagated in those respective markets so that they get to be part of that innovation and it's not just imported. So the problem is this actual little demographic, which is that 60% of the globe right now in the emerging markets doesn't have good or any real internet access. And so the presumption that you're going to have a lot of innovation and venture ecosystems built in most of those countries right now is actually false. So when we look at venture ecosystems, we don't just say, is there capital there, is there talent there? You have to literally say, is there infrastructure there? That's both educational infrastructure, but it can also be telecom infrastructure. So you all know the leapfrogging story, healthcare, education, all these things are super tech-enabled. But as the IFC, what we try to do is when we look at the key elements of a venture ecosystem, we want to make sure that we don't try to crowd out the private sector. That's a very important part of the World Bank mission, which is, I'm the IFC part of it on the private side. And what they do is we do a diagnostic and pretty much say, in this particular market, it looks like the private sector should really be leading the way. And in that case, I, as an IFC person, will actively work there. If it really needs intervention at more basic levels, that's where the World Bank would work. And then occasionally there are markets where we actually work together, which I'll share an example of that. Some of the key things we look for, as I mentioned earlier, skills pipeline, financial pipeline. International connectivity is something I think a lot of people don't think about. I think the Endeavor Network actually speaks a lot about it. Often if they are more recluse and haven't been exposed to a lot of international just mentorship, is often something that you can work on without having to cost a lot of money, and is usually a good igniter of a venture ecosystem. So when we think about overall ecosystems from a funding view, it really starts from like angel all the way out to public markets. And so the first phase is really the earliest part of it, and it's more around co-working and angels. And in this phase, this isn't really part of what I do and what my team does. This is something that more the World Bank does. And in fact, we just finished advising the World Bank, our team, helping them design programs in Morocco and Lebanon, where the governments have been provided a loan from the World Bank, and the stipulation of the loan is that they set up an innovation authority, and then that authority sets up essentially a group that can do concept development grants, it can do angel funding kind of grants, and it can even set up all the way up to like a seed fund program. As they build out those pieces, that loan gets dispersed to them, but it's ensured that they've built each step before they get more of the loan. Separately, this is more of where my team begins to work. So we have a couple of things that we use in the market. Tech Emerge is what we use to work with young companies that are just super early, but it allows us to take the existing IFC investments. So IFC does about $20 billion a year of investing, not venture, because that would be more like SoftBank. But in our case, we do about $20 billion, and most of that's lending. And we take some of the big companies that we lend to, and we introduce them to the young companies that have technologies in these markets. And so Tech Emerge today, we've done it in India. We're just finishing it in Brazil, in the healthcare sector. And it provides a free commercial pilot for each of the companies that get selected by these larger companies. Then we set up something called the Ifc Startup Catalyst. And this allows us to fund seed funds and accelerators in the emerging markets. And that's something that, as you'll see in the ecosystem development, often that's a very good area to focus your time if it's a younger market. And then a lot of what my team does besides direct investing is we do Series A funds. So we look for the best Series A funds in the markets where we invest, and we provide LP capital. And so an example of one of the companies that we backed in the accelerator seed fund space is a company called NXTP Labs. Some people might know of it. It's been a great story for us. It was an early market in Latin America where we weren't looking to do a lot of Series B investing, and we wanted to seed the market. And they now have funded about 200 companies and accelerated several hundred more. And now that fund manager has graduated and is raising a Series A fund to invest in the best companies of its accelerator. And we are now an investor in that fund. And it's a perfect example of we've patiently waited as opposed to going in and trying to do just Series B deals where there's not a lot of capital around the table. And the final stage is really where my team spends all of its time. And this is direct investing into the emerging markets for kind of late venture, early growth companies. And then, of course, as you get all the way out to the public markets, you're getting to where the IFC's $20 billion a year really operates. So I'll skip the impact slide, but I will simply end with, I think what I've seen in the 6 years I've been at the IFC is I've seen mistakes made by outsiders coming into some very nascent markets, trying to spur different pieces of the ecosystem without understanding that they are connected. Simple things like funding a Series B or C fund and not understanding why it's not doing much, or investing in bad deals. The reality is you have to start from the bottoms up and make sure the foundation, from talent to capital to even just entrepreneurial spirit, is something that exists in those markets. And so we don't come in with an immediacy. We come in a very patient way. And I'm excited that some of you are, hopefully will be soon, co-investors of ours. Thank you.